came to us from Peace Brewing Company in Chicago, and he's been really killing it for us. He's the reason I sleep now, so that's good. But anyway, Civil Life Brewing Company, we're about ready to celebrate our next anniversary here in September, so we'll be celebrating 3 years. The first time I did this, Karen asked who had heard of Civil Life, and it was crickets. And every time I've done it since, it's more and more. So it's really cool to see that our beer's getting around and people are finding some favor with it, and we're able to plug ahead. Our brewery is in Tower Grove South. It's essentially north of Bevo, Tower Grove South area, near the corner of Gravely and Chippewa. And we'd love to have you come down sometime. And of course, we always love it when people have our beer out and about around town. Cicero's is a great place to have beer too. There we go. So come down sometime. We do a lot of, I just call it pub beer. We do a lot of session styles, and the word session is, it's historic, but really in a contemporary sense. Session beer is just beer that's meant to be drank in some quantity without necessarily having to worry too much about your condition due to higher alcohol levels. So we do tend to kind of brew within a pretty tight window of about 4% to about 6% ABV. We do occasionally do a couple of larger beers throughout the year as part of a big beer series that stretches the limits of ABV for us. So we'll get close to 7 every once in a while. But for the most part, if you order a Civil Life beer, you can be pretty sure it's going to be between 4 and 6%. And a lot of restaurants really like that. Our beer really sits well at the table, and with a lot of good food, and we really keep to a lot of very traditional beer styles. English Pale Ale, German Wheat, American Brown, American Pale Ale, all of these things are pretty standard subjects here at the moment. Thank you. We kind of let some of the other breweries in town do a lot of the experimentation, and we just try to keep the wheel round rather than reinvent it all the time. This first beer is the German Wheat. And we just recently reworked this beer just a little bit, mainly because we were having some production issues, not in terms of quality, but the yeast that we were using, wheat beer yeast is a real miracle, because you can throw a German-style wheat beer yeast at very little malt, and you end up with a very flavorful beer. German wheat yeast is just such an essential component of this beer that if you were to make it with a standard, let's just call it ale yeast, like a plain Jane guy, this would be a really boring beer. But the German yeast strain captures so much life and vigor and energy. It's got a little bit of banana, a little bit of clove. You can kind of go on and on with these sorts of things. But anyway, back to the reason why we had a little bit of an issue with this beer. The original yeast strain we were using was a blended yeast strain. It was German wheat and a neutral strain. And the reason we were using it was that it would clarify nicely for us in the tank. But as we kept reusing this yeast, the dominant strain turned out to be the neutral strain, and it would outpace the German strain and eventually defeat it. So we would have to start blending back batches, and it just became kind of a real issue. So what we did is we just got rid of the blended strain, and we started using just a 100% German strain. And it's really, the flavor profile is really kind of difficult to manage as it was previous, but we're almost there. The reason we didn't go with the German strain initially is we thought it might be a little too overpowering for the beer. And so we kind of depended a little bit on that plain Jane strain in there to kind of knock it back a little bit. But it turns out that if you just ferment it a little bit cooler, it kind of maintains a lot of the same characters. But the German yeast is vital in the beer. You know, beer's only 4 things, so those 4 things better be good. You've got wheat. You've got malted barley or malted wheat or spelt or some sort of malted grain. You've got yeast. And you've got water. So you've got to make sure that those 4 things are either in balance, or that one of those things is so truly great that it deserves being the highlight of a beer. Sometimes you get 2 or 3 of those things, and that's great, but we always strive to kind of make sure that all 4 things are working together. The other thing you'll notice about wheat beer is that it's oftentimes fairly cloudy, and that's actually due to a couple of things. Wheat has a lot of protein in it, and protein can really hang up in a beer. You're really just kind of seeing a kind of protein haze. Wheat yeast also stays suspended for a long time in beer, so haze can be due to yeast too, although when you look at a beer, you're not really seeing yeast cells because they're so small. But given the multitude of yeast that's hanging up in the beer, the haze can also be a little bit contributed to that. So sometimes you'll see bottles of wheat beer, and they'll ask you to like roll around on a table to kind of resuspend the yeast, and that's why they're doing that. Wheat beer is just kind of naturally cloudy. Our wheat beer is just over. And I always find a lot of comedy in our beers that I don't think a lot of other people get. It just cracked me up that our wheat beer was the biggest beer we made at 5%. And that's usually a brewery, if they make a wheat beer, it's kind of because we have to, and it's usually like it's almost like an afterthought. And wheat beers are usually kind of the lower ABV on the spectrum, and they're generally made to be that beer when somebody comes to their pub who only likes so-and-so beer, and they're like, well, here's our wheat beer. So we try to stay away from that attitude. Wheat beer is, one of the finest examples of wheat beer in the entire world is Weihenstephan. They make some of the best beers on planet Earth. And if you ever get your hands on a Weihenstephan wheat beer, please come and tell me what we can do to our beer to move our beer closer to their beer, because I think they do a spectacular job, and I think that Weihenstephan, they're one of the oldest breweries that's still extant, and they have a brewing school, and I think actually Florian from Urban Chestnut went down there, and they're absolutely amazing. But to their credit, they've also been making beer for hundreds of years, and I've been making beer for about 6, so I've got a little ways to go yet. 10,050. Okay, well, well, maybe I shouldn't brag on them so much then. Yeah. Well, that's great. I appreciate that. This isn't really a talk about Weihenstephan, but one of the big things about our beer, and you'll notice it very much in this beer right now, I notice it when we send our beers off for competition, we carbonate pretty low. And a lot of beer, especially wheat beer, is carbonated much higher than the way we carbonate. We carbonate everything across the board so that all of our bars and restaurants don't have fundamental pouring issues from beer to beer if they make switches. I also don't carbonate my beer very heavily because I don't really like a real gassy beer. I think it's something that we've come to in this day and age mainly because of soda. Beer never has really experienced high carbonation levels, except maybe some of the Belgian and French traditions, maybe some of the German wheat beers. Getting glass to not explode under pressure was a big problem, and so a lot of beer was very lightly carbonated. Cask beer is a great example of very lightly carbonated beer, and I've just always preferred it. And I try not to get my preferences out onto the public. It's none of my business what you drink, but since I make the beer, I get to carb the beer. so that's why a lot of our beer is a little more lightly carbed. It's carbed to about 2.2 volumes, 2.3 volumes. The standard is about 2.6. And you ask, well, what's the standard? Well, the standard is set by the big beer companies, and it is set by them because they sell the most beer. So if you're a bar or restaurant and you're trying to pour beer, of course you're going to set your draft system to 2.6 because those are the brands that sell the highest. So everybody else kind of follows suit. But in reality, every beer style should be carved to a different level. It's just that by the time you start pouring taps, it's very, very difficult for a bar or restaurant to acquire enough regulators and a tap structure and someone to handle all that to actually have that all independently regulated. So pretty much every bar and restaurant is going to operate on one tap system. Some of them do a little bit different, but cool. So anyway, our German wheat is again, it's made with a 100% German yeast, Moravian malt, wheat, Hallertau hops, and we don't do a lot of water treatment on it. In fact, we only do extensive water treatment on a couple beers. We pretty much leave the water alone here in St. Louis. The next beer is the British Pale. And this beer, yes?
Just had a question from somebody else.
Sure.
And this goes right to the heart of what you do.
Yep.
You don't have fancy names for your beers. You just name them according to precisely the style they are.
Sure. Yeah, the statement or question was we don't give fanciful names for a beer. Everything is called by the style. So English Pale, we've actually had a couple of names for this beer. It started off as English Bitter because in England, bitter is just pale ale. But also in England, they take pale ale so seriously that they have different categories of pale ale, whereas we've kind of settled on just pale ale. In England, you have ordinary, you have special, and you have extra special. Each one of those categories can go by other names too, but they essentially have 3 different categories for pale ale depending on if you're describing something in the middle and then something a little bigger yet. We first called this beer English Bitter, and we realized that a lot of people thought that that meant the beer was bitter, which it's not. It's actually not bitter at all. But we were referencing the fact that it was an English Pale. So now it's called English Pale Bitter. And that seems to help. Sales took off like a rocket after we stopped calling it just English Bitter. But it's this is one of the first recipes. So before we opened this brewery, it was just me, Jake, and Mike brewing in my basement. And the English Pale was one of the first recipes that we ever felt like, if we ever get this ball rolling, if we ever actually build this brewery that we've been talking about for 2 years, this is a beer that we want to really kind of have in our corner. You know, like it was one of the first beers that we really figured out. And actually Mike figured it out. And it's really straightforward. It's just Thomas Fawcett Maris Otter, which is a type of malt. It comes from the UK. It's kind of at this point in time, it's kind of a heritage grain. They don't grow a lot of Maris Otter anymore, except in England, because it's a little difficult to grow and it doesn't give you quite the same yield as other types of barleys. But it's neat and it's a family-run business, and we always found that the malt made really great beer. It's kind of the heart and soul of nearly all of our English beer. We use a lot from Thomas Fawcett just because they have really done well as a maltster. And by maltster, I simply mean they're the ones that take grain from the field and they turn it into a usable product for a brewery. Like if you just went out to a field and got a bunch of grain and took it to a brewery, you wouldn't really be able to do anything with it because it hasn't been modified for brewing purposes. So that's the whole reason you have maltsters. They prep the grain before you use it. It's kind of like if you go to the grocery store and you buy like a pre-made dinner. All you have to do is go home and warm it up. And as a brewer, that's what the grain is. It's already ready for you. All you have to do is get it wet and go. So anyway, the English Pale is it's a little more modest than the German wheat. It's a little over 4%. It's hopped maybe with a little bit more of a contemporary sense of it all. It's hopped both with East Kent Goldings, which is a traditional British hop. It's used a lot for dry hopping. It's a little bit grassy, a little hay-like, lots of maybe floral types of aromas, but then it's balanced next to Centennial, which is a North American hop, which, if you're familiar with hops at all, it would be one of the sea hops that comes out of the Pacific Northwest. And the sea hops are like Cascade and Columbus and Centennial and blah, blah, blah. And all of these hops they're more aggressive somehow in kind of a citric, piney kind of a fashion. But anyway, the two hops kind of come together in a nice way. And we thought it was a good synergy of trying to comprehend some of the tradition that we were going after, but also admitting that it's 2000 whatever it is now, and we can't just be traditional. Like you gotta nod your head to the time that you're in. The English Pale is one that we do a little bit of water treatment on. And back to water, if you build a brewery anywhere in the world, if you do nothing to your water, it will either sink or make your brewery successful. If you are a brewer in Florida, you are hating life because your water is terrible. So the first thing you have to do is you have to make your water really, really good so that you can brew with it. If you're a brewer in St. Louis, Missouri, you can almost just open the tap and make beer because our water is so righteously good in comparison. And if you look at beer styles throughout the world, that's actually the reason why beer styles developed in certain cities. It's the reason why Guinness developed in Ireland. Ireland has tremendously hard water, so the chemistry of brewing, it's complicated, but the reason it works is that anytime you use a lot of roasted barley in with that type of water, there's a kind of balance that happens, and it lets that beer be successful. If they were to try to brew a really, really pale beer in Dublin, it would come off a little harsh because of their water. Same can be said of Pilsen in the Czech Republic, like Pilsner Urquell. Their water is so very, very soft that they can very successfully brew a very light colored beer. Their dark colored beers might not be as successful just because of the water. So here in St. Louis, we kind of have the best of both worlds because our water it lies in this chemical state of being almost perfect for just about anything golden to dark brown. So we can effectively brew just about anything without hardly any water adjustment. The English Pale, we do a very small water adjustment to bring it a little closer to England, but we don't bring it too close because there's also like a notion of like, winemakers have like their terroir, their earth, their farm, and you don't want to get too far away from what's already being given to you. And one of the things we're being given at our brewery is good water, so we try not to muck it up too much. But sometimes if you adjust here or there, and you can get some things to happen. And one of the things in the English Pale is if you up the sodium bicarbonate and the calcium level just a little bit, your hop note expresses a little better. And you see that across the board in some of the other hoppy beers. Our brown beer, in comparison, needs a lot of sodium bicarbonate to adjust for the colors of some of the darker malts. Back to Dublin. Dublin has a lot of sodium bicarbonate in their water, so they don't have to actually add that to their water. It's already there. So they can brew dark beer willy-nilly. What else to say about the English Pale? The English Pale has been kind of my go-to for a long time, and I think it was one of those beers that we really tried to strive this balance of like make something interesting, but make something that's more of a companion piece to maybe conversation or a meal, rather than making something that's going to steal the spotlight. And I think you can say that about a lot of our beer, at least philosophically. Hopefully we do enough good that it steals some kind of spotlight. But I think in the end, like, our goal as a brewery is to make beer that enjoys a larger crowd than just itself. So, for instance, like we try to do some work with some other restaurants in town, some of the accounts that have done well for us. We try to, we've made beers for Dave Bailey and some of his restaurants in the Block and Webster Groves and Amsterdam Soccer Bar and such. And what we found is there's kind of a sympathy with our beer and these other sorts of things in life. And that's one of the cool things about English Pale, is that it's such a I don't want to say it's such a normal beer, but it kind of is, and that's what's kind of nice about it, is that you get to experience something that people have been experiencing for a long time. Bellying up to the bar and getting an English Pale is one of the highlights of anybody's day, I hope. It's the highlight of my day, anyway. As a brewer, you have to drink a lot of beer. It's part of the job. And cool. People are kind of somewhat astounded at the fact that, we're drinking beer at 8 in the morning. But it's not really drinking beer. It's making sure that every beer that you drink is going to be good. And so we do a lot of sensory in the morning before we drink coffee. because coffee is kind of renowned palate killer. I got the APA here now. And those of you who have followed us for the last couple of years may notice that this APA is quite a bit different than the first APA that we made. The first APA, and I'll blame that on Brandon in a good way. The first APA we made it really followed my tastes, which were, I was really kind of thinking back to 90s brew pub culture of kind of those classic Cascade hop pale ales. And that's what I brewed. We just made a straight up Cascade pale ale, and I really thought it was cool because it really kind of reminded me of where brew pub culture and where craft beer came from. And it was a good beer, did well for us, but we didn't remake it again for a while, and we got busy with some other stuff. And then when we hired Brandon, we had kind of the opportunity to brew it again, and he took a look at the recipe, and he was like, well, this looks pretty cool. And he said something like, this looks really old school. And I was like, I think he just called me old. And so I said, all right, well, let's see what we can do. And so he, like I said, he had been brewing at Peace, and they had been using kind of a regimen of many different hops in their pale ale. And we thought, there's no reason why we can't brew 2 or 3 different pale ales. It's fine, we need to experiment and see what's out there. So I kind of let them loose a little bit, and we ended up putting 7 different hops in the pale ale, and which was really, it's the most hops we've ever used in a beer. And I struggled to pick them all out, but I can definitely find like there's an amalgam of all of them that kind of came through in kind of a cool way. We used a new hop to us called Vanguard, which is another Pacific Northwesty guy the Vanguard's probably the hardest to find in the beer. We still used a little bit of Cascade, a little bit Centennial. We used a hop called Galena, which I think you can find the easiest. We also use that in a beer for 5 Star. They've got a couple of hamburger joints here in town, and we use it in their amber beer. And Galena has kind of this real kind of thick, unctuous, kind of piney note that is, it's definitely one of the things that really sticks out in this beer a little bit. And I shouldn't have started naming all the hops because now I'm going to forget what they all are. But anyway, suffice to say, we also dry hopped the beer as well. And I think it kind of came across in a much more kind of 2010-ish kind of way than my original APA. And so I think we're going to bounce back and forth between the two. Because I still like the first one. I like this one a lot. This one just has a little bit more meat on its bones. The clarity on this beer, it's not quite as clear as the first one, and I think primarily that's due to dry hopping. It's really hard to get a beer to really clarify well after you dry hopped, because there's a lot of matter on hops and in hops that specific oils and things like that don't really become water soluble or beer soluble, so they kind of suspend and they float around, and it's really hard. We don't filter anything, which is kind of it's a touchy subject for breweries. Like, there's this whole thing with tradition with beer that's vastly important, and I think that's one of the reasons why beer is still so popular, is it has so much tradition and people have so much longevity with it. Like, I think the last thing in the world anybody ever wants to read is like the word natural flavors in their beer. Like that always just like really, what? That sounds so horrible. But it's natural, right? But it's one of those bugaboos, and I don't think people really understand how closely wed they are to beer until they read things like that. But anyway, filtering beer and not filtering beer is really a personal choice of how you want your beer to look and how fast you want it to come out. The third most important thing is, if you're filtering your beer, you're probably filtering it so that it can withstand horrible conditions in the outside world. Because in the brewery, all of your tanks are temperature controlled. You've got a cold room. Everything's cold. And then usually the minute your beer hits the streets, it might be cold, it might not. Like everybody's been to the grocery store or to the gas station where they got some beer cold and some beer warm. And
warm beer never enjoys a good life unless it's been filtered. And then, if it's been filtered, it will be fine. We choose not to filter for two reasons. One, filtering is expensive. And also, filtering does inherently take something away from the beer that you had meant to put in it. Filtering isn't the worst thing in the world. In fact, filtering can be something really cool. I made the comment to somebody one time. I still haven't decided if this is true, but I kind of think filtering is a little bit like makeup. It's not necessary, but it's kind of nice, and don't hold me to that. And nobody print any of that either. This is all off the record. Oh, what's Twitter? I still have a flip phone, so I'm safe. So APA, as far as, so we haven't really talked a whole lot about yeast yet for the APA. The APA we use, we generally use about 3 different yeasts during any given month, which is a real trick for the brewers because you have to keep it going, you have to keep it alive. On your side of things, it really doesn't matter. On your side of things, what it does is it allows us to make, hopefully, a portfolio of beer that doesn't share too many similar qualities to make any one beer seem like the next. So in our pale ale, in our brown beer, and our rye, they all 3 share a yeast strain. It's just kind of it's just called American ale yeast, and it works really well. It doesn't flocculate real well, which is the word flocculate. What that means is when you put yeast in wort, which is beer that is not fermented yet, the yeast go in and they start converting sugar into alcohol, and when they're done feeding, essentially, they flocculate, which is to say they have a different static charge, and it will either cause them to attract to one another and basically make a big mat of yeast, and some of them float to the top, which are called top fermenters, and some of them sink to the bottom, which are called bottom fermenters. Top fermenters are usually ales, and bottom fermenters are usually lagers, but that's not always the case. It's an easy way to say it, but there's always differences to the rule, or what's the phrase? Exceptions to the rule. So the only way you can truly identify a lager yeast versus an ale yeast, if you don't know, is to run a specific sugar test on it. Lager yeast will eat a particular kind of sugar that ale yeast will not, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter, but that's how you tell. You can't tell any other way. The shape, how the temperature at which they ferment. Yeah, homebrewers read the package. Yeah, mine just come in tubes. I just throw it in. Yeast are really cool because yeast are just little organisms, and I often talk about yeast kind of like tomatoes. There's hundreds of different kinds of tomatoes, right? Well, there's hundreds of different kinds of yeast. So you can put any yeast in a sugar solution and it'll ferment. It might not ferment the way you want, but it'll ferment, it'll make alcohol. So really my job is to make sure I'm throwing the right yeast in the right sugar solution to make what I want. That's my job. When you go to pick a yeast, back to flocculation, if you're not filtering, if you don't pick yeast that naturally flocculate, you end up with beer that is maybe a little cloudy. And those are called powdery yeast strains. If you get a yeast strain that is heavy on the flocculation side of things, sometimes they'll actually drop out of the beer before they're done fermenting, so you've got to kind of mess with them kind of yet again. English strains are notorious oftentimes for being top fermenters and heavy flocculators. And it's fascinating as you look at beer, it's like, well, is it the chicken or the egg? Which came first? Did the styles of beer that they were brewing in England make the yeast start doing this, or was the yeast doing this and they just followed suit and made that kind of beer? It happens like that all over the world, especially with lager strains. But anyway, so our English strains, what happens with them is they take off like a rocket during primary ferment, and then they instantly hit the bottom of the tank when they're done. So we have to get them off and get them into the next beer lickety split, because the bottom of a tank is real tight quarters for a yeast strain that has already eaten up all the food stores. So they're just sitting down there dying. So you got to get them out and get them to the next beer party as quick as you can. And it doesn't always work in your favor because sometimes you don't need that beer. So luckily we've got kind of a ingenious system of shuttling yeast around the brewery to keep it going, and that's what we do. That's what brewers do, is they make little vats of sugar and invite yeast to a beer party and keep temperatures correct. Temperature is maybe another thing with yeast too. So back to my ale, my APA. The ale strain, or the ale strain that we ferment that with, will comfortably ferment anywhere from like 64 to like 72 degrees. And it will probably give you mostly the same beer at any of those temperatures. But you could ferment it at 50 degrees and you could ferment it at 90 degrees. It would still make beer, but the flavor would be completely out of spec. Different alcohols are created at different temperature ranges, so you can actually create the type of alcohol that smells like nail polish if you fermented it at 100. So that's one of the reasons why, as a brewer, you're constantly running around the brewery checking temperatures, because your yeast don't care what they're doing. They're not trying to make beer. They're just trying to eat. So as long as your parameters are good, you've got the right amount of sugar, your brewing water's good, you haven't inundated the tank with a lot of extra hop, which kind of adds its own little scenario to yeast. As long as you do all these things, beer will probably come out the other side the way you expect. But brewing beer is full of surprises, and this is a side note, but 6 weeks ago, I was brewing Oktoberfest, and it was 2 turns into the same tank, so we were brewing 2 batches of beer into 1 tank. And on the second batch of the beer, I accidentally left a drain hose open. So instead of having a full batch of beer, I lost about, well, I won't say how much I lost. It's embarrassing. But that sort of thing happens, especially when I'm at work. But I don't think that really in our day and age, like, we have so much beer available. Like when you just go to the grocery store and you just open up the case, it's like beer comes flying at you. You know, it's like, I can't believe how much beer Schnucks has added in the last 10 years. Like, it's crazy. But I think that there's still kind of a little bit of a disjunction between how beer is made and beer on the shelf. We're getting closer, and I think that all the craft beer that's being brewed in town and across the world is really helping that, because for years breweries haven't really done a great job at connecting with people. They've been brilliant marketing campaigns and things like that, but they haven't done a good job at connecting with people, and I think that's where craft brew can really lend a hand. I hope. And this is an American brown beer. The American brown beer, after I mentioned the English Pale, the American brown beer was the first beer that we brewed at the brewery. And it was such a load off my shoulders to actually taste the beer when it came out of the tank, because I was like, we might make it. When we brewed it at the brewery, it tasted better than any homebrewed version we'd ever done before. In fact, every brew that we've done at the brewery has almost been better than anything we've done at home, and that's primarily due to the fact that our brewery is built to make beer, and my basement was hardly built to do laundry. We had 3 dogs kicking around, and mostly we just used it as an excuse to play Risk. But the thing about, and I don't like to use the word professional about anything that I do, but professional brewing, as I've learned, I used to be a carpenter, and it was pretty quickly that I learned that a screwdriver is not a pry bar. A pry bar is a pry bar. And in a professional brewery, that that really follows suit. Everything in a brewery is meant to do a particular job, and hopefully meant to do that job well, and hopefully designed well. And in our brewery, we have a great brew house, we have great fermenters, we have a great cooling scenario, a great glycol chiller. We've got great keg washer. Everything we have at our disposal is designed to make good beer. So we've actually really benefited from just having, competent equipment. We've tried to source grain and hops and yeast from reliable sources, and I think when these things happen and they come together with, again, good water from your city, you can hope to expect good things. The brown beer has really surpassed any sort of notion I had about how we were going to do as a brewery. And I know, obviously not everybody likes it because, personal taste. But it has done well for us, and I've been excited about that for a couple of reasons. One is that it's been my experience. I used to be a bartender too. I hope I never say I used to be a brewer. But it's been my experience that when you have a company like a brewery, let's say you make 12 beers, chances are real good that your strongest selling beers are going to be your lighter styles. Again, with the whole wheat beer thing, the reason a lot of breweries feel like they have to make lighter style beers is you can kind of appease more people, is the belief. We've really kind of bucked that trend with the brown beer in that it's far and away our biggest selling beer. We sell probably 65% of all the beer we make is brown beer, which to me, I never would have guessed it. But anyway, enough about all that. The brown beer is again made with some Thomas Fawcett Maris Otter, which it's in a lot of our beer. I really like that malt a lot. We also get some brown malt from them, and brown malt, or malt in general, is kilned not in a dissimilar way than coffee beans. So pale malt, at the maltster, what happens is they get kernels of barley from the fields, they hydrate it so that it begins to sprout like it's going to turn into a plant, and then they arrest that seed's development through heat. They basically just tell it to knock it off. It goes into drought mode, and it just shuts down, but it had started to sprout, so it's basically starting to unpack all the energy that this seed was going to make into a new plant. The maltster knows exactly when to turn that kernel off. That way, when I rehydrate it, it starts to kick back into that plant mode again, and that's how I get all the stuff out. Brown malt is a roasted malt, and there's basically three different kinds of malt. There's pale malt or base malt or lager malt. All these are kind of just base malts. And usually all that means is it's been modified to the point of being able to make beer, but it doesn't have a lot of color, so that if you're going to make any other kinds of beers, you can do it with abandon and you can doctor the color up later. So pale malt is pretty banal in terms of color, but it's going to make beer. Then you've got crystal malt. Crystal malt could have been pale malt, but generally speaking, they keep it hydrated a little bit differently, and especially under kilning conditions, they keep it hydrated longer, and what happens is you make a different kind of sugar that's less fermentable by essentially heating the sugars while they're wet in the kernel. You're able to kind of keep some residual sugar in the beer, and that's crystal malt. And then you've got roast malts, which are kilned with hardly any moisture at all. So the exterior of the husk almost gets a little burnt, and there's not much moisture at all. And it's kind of the difference between braising something, which we'll just call that crystal malt, and roasting something in a dry heat oven. That's kind of the difference. And anytime you have a roasted malt, usually the exterior of the malt, the husk, like the little jacket, gets real burnt and it's real bitter. But that flakes off really quick. But that also imparts a lot of color. You get a lot of color from that husk. So if you drink a beer that's dark, that has an overtly bitter flavor to it, it could actually have over-extracted tannins and astringency from that burnt husk. There are other types of roasted malts where they actually physically take the husk off, and those are called dehusked roast malts, and they still impart a lot of chocolate and dark flavors, but you don't get so much astringency from them. It's kind of like the difference between like dark chocolate and milk chocolate, you know. But anyway, the brown malt that we use does have a husk, so we get a little bit of we kind of bookend the beer a little bit, I think, with the roasted quality of the brown malt, but it's not heated so much like, say, a roast malt that it completely burns it up and makes it acrid. You get a lot of flavor out of that brown malt. And way back in the day, when maltsters made malt, it was really probably hard to make really light malt, and it was probably really hard to make sort of light malt. It was probably easy to make amber malt and burnt malt. So that's what people drank. But now maltsters are really, really good at doing their job, so now you can have everything from Pilsner to Imperial Stout brewed at the same brewery, which is neat. It's the first time pretty much ever that's happened. We live in a pretty special time.